Here's the Christmas morning we'd all been waiting for. The tree was lit up, presents were piled underneath, and the whole family was gathered around in our pajamas. I was 35, feeling pretty good about life, and ready to dig into the gift-opening frenzy with my wife and kids. We started tearing into the presents, wrapping paper flying everywhere. The kids were squealing with delight over their new toys, and I was feeling that warm, fuzzy feeling you get when everything seems right with the world. I'd just opened a new set of golf clubs for my wife, something I'd been hinting at for months. As I was examining one of the irons, I felt a little twinge in my chest. Nothing major, just a bit of discomfort. I figured it was probably from all the rich food we'd been eating over the holidays. You know how it is. Too many cookies and eggnog can do a number on you. I didn't think much of it and kept on with the festivities. A few minutes later, though, that little twinge turned into something I couldn't ignore. It was like someone was squeezing my chest from the inside. I tried to take a deep breath, but it felt like I couldn't get enough air. I remember looking up at the Christmas tree, the lights suddenly seeming too bright and blurry. I must have made a noise or something because my wife stopped mid-sentence and looked at me. Her face changed in an instant. I could see the worry creeping in. I tried to tell her I was fine, but the words wouldn't come out right. The pain in my chest was getting worse, spreading down my left arm. Next thing I knew, I was on the floor. I don't remember falling, but suddenly I was looking up at the ceiling, the Christmas tree lights swirling above me. Everything seemed to be happening in slow motion. I could hear my kids crying, my wife's voice sounding far away even though I could see her right above me. The room was spinning, and I felt cold sweat breaking out all over my body. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was lie there gasping for air while chaos erupted around me. Through the haze, I saw my wife on the phone, her voice shaking as she talked to what I assumed was 911. Time seemed to stretch and contract. One moment, it felt like hours had passed. The next, everything was a blur of motion. Suddenly, there were strangers in the room. Paramedics, I realized. They were talking fast, using words I didn't understand. I felt them lifting me onto something hard. A stretcher, probably. As they wheeled me out, I caught glimpses of my family's terrified faces. The Christmas tree, the torn wrapping paper, my new golf clubs. It all seemed so surreal now. The cold air hit me as we got outside, a stark contrast to the warmth of moments ago. In the ambulance, everything became a jumble of sensations. The siren wailing, the bumps in the road, the paramedic's face hovering over me. They put something on my chest, electrodes maybe? And I heard beeping. The pain was still there, intense and unrelenting. I wanted to ask what was happening, but I couldn't form the words. When we got to the hospital, it was like being thrown into a whirlwind. Bright lights, urgent voices, more faces I didn't recognize. They rushed me through corridors into a room filled with intimidating equipment. Someone cut off my Christmas pajamas. I had a fleeting thought about how my wife had just given them to me last night. Doctors and nurses swarmed around me, calling out numbers and medical terms. I caught phrases like ST elevation and cardiac enzymes, but they meant nothing to me. The pain in my chest was still there, but now it was competing with the fear of not knowing what was happening to me. A doctor leaned over me, his face serious. "You're having a heart attack," he said. The words hit me like a physical blow. A heart attack? But I was only 35. I exercised, I ate pretty well most of the time. How could this be happening? Before I could process this, they were moving me again. Someone mentioned the cath lab, and suddenly I was scared in a way I'd never been before. I wanted to ask for my wife to see my kids one more time, but everything was moving too fast. In the cath lab, more bright lights, more machines. They told me they were going to insert a catheter through my groin to my heart. I nodded, not really understanding, just wanting the pain to stop. I felt a prick, then a strange sensation of something moving inside me. It wasn't painful, just unsettling. As they worked, the doctor explained that I had a congenital heart defect, something I'd been born with but never knew about. It had gone undetected my whole life, waiting like a ticking time bomb. And today, of all days, it had decided to make itself known. I lay there, trying to comprehend how my life had changed so drastically in the span of an hour. From opening Christmas presents to fighting for my life, it seemed impossible. The beeping of the heart monitor became my focus, each beat a reminder that I was still here, still fighting. The procedure seemed to go on forever. I drifted in and out, the medication making everything hazy. At some point, I realized the crushing pain in my chest had eased. The doctor's voice cut through the fog. They'd managed to clear the blockage, he said. They'd saved my heart, but the battle wasn't over. As they wheeled me out of the cath lab, my mind was reeling. Christmas morning, heart attack, congenital defect. The words swirled in my head. I caught a glimpse of a clock on the wall. It wasn't even noon yet. Hey there. Hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel to grow and reach more people. And now. I was in the kitchen getting everything ready for our Christmas breakfast. The house was quiet, just the sound of bacon sizzling in the pan and the coffee maker gurgling. My husband was still asleep, and I figured our 4-year-old son was playing with his new toys in the living room. I was cracking eggs into a bowl when I heard it. A loud crash from the living room, like something heavy had fallen. At first I thought maybe our son had knocked over a chair or something, but then I realized it was too loud for that. I dropped the egg I was holding and ran to the living room. The scene that greeted me stopped me in my tracks. Our Christmas tree was on the floor, ornaments scattered everywhere. And there, partially hidden under the branches, was my son. He wasn't moving. For a second I couldn't breathe. I just stood there staring at the mess of pine needles and tinsel, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then I snapped out of it and rushed over to him. I started pulling branches away, pricking my fingers on the needles, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting to my son. When I finally uncovered him, my stomach dropped. He was lying face down, completely still. I gently turned him over, calling his name. His eyes were closed and there was a nasty bump forming on his forehead. I put my hand on his chest, desperately searching for the rise and fall of his breathing. It was there, but it was shallow. I tried to wake him up, patting his cheeks, calling his name louder, but he didn't respond. His skin felt clammy under my hands and I noticed a small trickle of blood coming from his nose. That's when the panic really set in. I scrambled to my feet, nearly tripping over the fallen tree, and ran to grab my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. When the operator answered, I found myself struggling to explain what had happened. The words tumbled out in a jumbled mess. Christmas tree fell, son, unconscious. The operator kept asking me to slow down, to breathe. She asked me if my son was breathing, if he was bleeding. I ran back to check on him, the phone pressed to my ear. Yes, he was breathing. Yes, there was some blood from his nose. No, he wasn't waking up. The operator told me help was on the way, but I needed to stay on the line. She asked me to keep talking to my son, to keep checking his breathing. I knelt next to him, one hand on his chest, feeling the slight rise and fall. I don't know how long I sat there talking to him, pleading with him to wake up. Every second felt like an hour. I kept glancing at the door, waiting to hear sirens. At some point, I heard my husband come downstairs. I heard his sharp intake of breath when he saw the scene. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't take my eyes off our son. I just told him to wait outside for the ambulance. Finally, I heard sirens in the distance. They grew louder and louder until they were right outside our house. I heard the front door open, voices calling out. Then the paramedics were there, kneeling beside us. They gently moved me aside, and I watched as they examined my son. They spoke in quick, professional tones, using words I didn't understand. One of them shined a light in my son's eyes while another checked his pulse. They asked me questions. How long had he been unconscious? Had he fallen before? Any allergies? I answered as best I could, but my mind felt foggy. I couldn't stop staring at my son's face, so still and pale. The paramedics worked quickly, placing a neck brace on my son and carefully lifting him onto a backboard. They explained they needed to take him to the hospital right away for a CT scan to check for any internal injuries. As they carried him out, I followed in a daze. The Christmas tree was still on the floor, ornaments crushed beneath it. Presents lay scattered and forgotten. None of it mattered. Outside, the neighbors were starting to gather, drawn by the commotion. I barely noticed them. All I could focus on was my son being loaded into the ambulance. One of the paramedics asked if I wanted to ride with them. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I climbed in, I saw my husband running out of the house, keys in hand. He called out that he'd follow in the car. The doors closed, and the ambulance started moving. Inside, it was a flurry of activity. The paramedics were attaching monitors, checking vitals. I sat in the corner, out of the way, my eyes fixed on my son's face. During the ride, one of the paramedics kept talking to my son, trying to get a response. He'd call out his name, then press on his chest or squeeze his hand. But there was no reaction, just the steady beep of the heart monitor. I found myself holding my breath every time the paramedic checked for a response, hoping to see some sign of consciousness. But each time, there was nothing. Just that awful stillness. The drive to the hospital seemed to take forever, even with the sirens blaring. Every turn, every stop at an intersection felt like it was delaying us. I wanted to scream at the other cars to get out of the way, even though they already were. When we finally arrived at the hospital, things started moving even faster. The back doors of the ambulance flew open, and suddenly there were more people, more voices. They whisked my son away, rattling off information to the hospital staff. I followed them into the emergency room, trying to keep up. But when they went through a set of double doors, a nurse stopped me. She said I needed to wait outside, that the doctors needed space to work. I stood there, staring at those doors, feeling completely helpless. The nurse led me to a waiting area, asking me questions about what had happened. I recounted the story again, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that waiting room. I couldn't tell if minutes or hours were passing. People came and went, but I barely noticed them. All I could think about was my son lying so still under that fallen Christmas tree. At some point, my husband arrived. He sat next to me, holding my hand. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. We just sat there, waiting for news. I woke up early on Christmas morning, excited to surprise the kids with their gifts. The house was quiet, and I could see it was still dark outside through the bedroom window. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake my wife, and made my way to the door. As I stepped into the hallway, I felt a chill. It was colder than usual, but I didn't think much of it. I just assumed the heating had kicked off during the night. I made my way down the stairs, avoiding the creaky spots I knew so well. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, something felt off. There was a draft, stronger than it should be. I looked towards the front of the house, and that's when I saw it. Our front door was wide open. My stomach dropped. I stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I approached the door slowly, my bare feet cold on the wooden floor. As I got closer, I noticed scratch marks around the lock. Someone had forced their way in. I quickly shut the door and locked it, my hands shaking as I did. I turned around, and that's when the full impact of what had happened hit me. Our living room was a mess. The Christmas tree was knocked over, ornaments scattered across the floor. But what really got me was the empty space under where the tree had been. All the presents we had carefully wrapped and placed there the night before were gone. I moved further into the room, stepping over broken decorations. Our TV was missing from its stand. The cabinet where we kept our electronics was open, shelves empty. My laptop, our tablets, all gone. I went to the mantel where we kept some family heirlooms. The antique clock my grandfather had given us was missing. So was the silver picture frame with our wedding photo. I made my way through the rest of the house. In the kitchen, drawers were pulled out, contents spilled onto the floor. They'd taken our good silverware, the expensive set we only used for special occasions. The back door was also unlocked, probably their exit route. In our home office, more destruction. File cabinets were open, papers everywhere. The safe where we kept important documents was gone completely. They must have carried it out whole. I went back upstairs, my mind racing. How could this have happened? How did we sleep through it? I checked on the kids first. They were still asleep, thankfully unaware of what had happened. Our bedroom was also a mess. Jewelry boxes empty, drawers ransacked. I woke up my wife, trying to keep my voice calm as I told her what had happened. She didn't believe me at first, thought I was playing some kind of joke, but as the reality sunk in, I could see the fear in her eyes. We decided not to wake the kids yet. I went downstairs to call the police while my wife got dressed. As I dialed, I noticed my hands were still shaking. The operator asked me a bunch of questions. When did I notice the break-in? What was missing? Was anyone hurt? I answered as best I could, but my mind was all over the place. While we waited for the police, I tried to take stock of what was gone. It wasn't just the presents and electronics. They'd taken things that couldn't be replaced. The necklace my wife's grandmother had given her. The watch my dad left me when he passed. Even the kids' piggy banks were gone. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. 2 officers came in, asked us to wait in the kitchen while they did an initial sweep of the house. We sat at the table, not saying much. I could hear them moving around, their radios crackling. When they came back, they started asking questions. Had we seen or heard anything suspicious lately? Did we have any enemies? Had we told anyone about our Christmas plans? It all seemed so surreal. This was our home, our safe place. Now it felt violated. They told us not to touch anything and started taking photos of the damage. One of the officers mentioned they'd check with the neighbors, see if anyone had seen or heard anything. I nodded, but I knew our nearest neighbors were a fair distance away. As the police were working, we heard the kids starting to wake up. My wife went upstairs to intercept them. I could hear her talking softly, trying to explain what had happened without scaring them too much. When they came downstairs, their eyes were wide, taking in the mess and the police presence. The youngest asked where all the presents were. I didn't know what to say. How do you explain to a kid that Christmas had been stolen? The older one seemed to understand more, asking if the bad guys were gone. I assured them they were, even though I wasn't entirely sure myself. The police finished their initial investigation and told us they'd be in touch. They gave us some paperwork to fill out, an inventory of everything that was taken. They also gave us a case number and said someone would follow up in a few days. After they left, we just stood there in our ransacked living room, not sure what to do next. The Christmas tree was still on its side, a stark reminder of how our holiday had been turned upside down. My wife suggested we start cleaning up, just to have something to do. As we began picking up the scattered ornaments and broken decorations, the reality of the situation really started to sink in. It wasn't just the material things that had been taken. Our sense of security, the joy we had felt just the night before as we prepared for Christmas morning, that was gone too. The kids tried to help, but they were clearly confused and upset. They kept asking questions we didn't have answers to. Will Santa bring more presents? Did the robbers take their stuff too? When will we get our things back? Each question was like a knife, reminding us of how powerless we were. As the morning wore on, we had to start making calls to the bank, to cancel our credit cards, to our insurance company, to start the claim process, to family members, to explain why we wouldn't be at Christmas dinner. Each call made the situation more real, more permanent. I found myself getting angry at the people who did this, angry at myself for not hearing them, angry at the world for letting this happen on Christmas of all days. But I tried to keep it together for the kids. They were watching us, taking cues from how we reacted. It was Christmas morning, and I woke up earlier than usual. My husband and I had been planning this surprise for months, our daughter's first car. We'd hidden the keys in a small gift box under the tree, and I could barely contain my excitement as I imagined her reaction. I got out of bed, careful not to wake my husband just yet. I wanted to make sure everything was perfect before we surprised our daughter. I crept downstairs, avoiding the creaky step, and peeked into the living room. The tree lights were still on from the night before, casting a warm glow over the presents. I smiled, thinking about how this Christmas would be one to remember. After checking that the car keys were still hidden in their box, I went to the kitchen to start the coffee. As it brewed, I glanced at the clock. It was still early, but I couldn't wait any longer. I decided to wake everyone up. I went to my husband first, gently shaking him awake. He groaned, but then remembered what day it was and smiled. We both got up and headed towards our daughter's room, whispering excitedly about how surprised she would be. When we reached her door, I knocked softly. There was no answer. I figured she was still asleep, so I opened the door slowly, ready to wake her with a cheerful, "Merry Christmas." But as the door swung open, the words died in my throat. The room was empty. The bed was made, which was unusual for her. It looked like it hadn't been slept in at all. I stepped inside, confused. My husband followed, his face mirroring my bewilderment. That's when I saw it. A piece of paper on her desk, folded in half. My stomach dropped as I picked it up. As I read the words, I felt like the floor was falling out from under me. Our daughter had run away with her boyfriend. She said she was in love and couldn't bear to be apart from him. She asked us not to look for her. I read the note out loud to my husband, my voice shaking. We stood there in shock for a moment, trying to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of sick joke. We snapped into action, searching the house, calling her name. Maybe she was hiding somewhere, playing a prank. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a joke. Each empty room we checked felt like another blow. I tried calling her cell phone while my husband checked the garage to see if any of our cars were missing. Her phone went straight to voicemail. All of our cars were accounted for, which meant she must have left with her boyfriend. We sat at the kitchen table, the cheerful Christmas decorations now seeming to mock us. My husband suggested we start calling her friends, see if anyone knew anything. I nodded, numb, as I started going through her contact list on my phone. Each call was the same. No one had seen her. No one knew anything. Some of her friends seemed genuinely shocked, others were evasive. I couldn't tell if they were hiding something or if they were just as clueless as we were. As the morning wore on, our panic increased. We decided to call the police. I dialed the number with shaking hands, and when the operator answered, I found myself struggling to explain the situation. The words "missing daughter" and "run away" felt surreal coming out of my mouth. The police told us they would send an officer over, but warned us that since our daughter had left voluntarily and was over 16, there wasn't much they could do. They classified it as a voluntary missing person case. The term made me feel sick. While we waited for the police to arrive, we tried to think of where she might have gone. We knew her boyfriend lived in the next town over, but we didn't have his address. We had only met him a few times, and our daughter had been secretive about their relationship. When the police officer arrived, he asked us a series of questions. How old was our daughter? Did she have a history of running away? Were there any signs of forced entry or struggle? Had she been acting differently lately? We answered as best we could, but it felt like we didn't know anything. The officer took down all the information and said he would put out an alert. He advised us to check her social media accounts, reach out to her school friends, and call local hospitals just in case. He left us with a case number and a promise to keep us updated. After the officer left, we sat in silence for a moment. The house felt eerily quiet. No excited chatter about Christmas presents, no music playing, just the soft hum of the refrigerator and our own ragged breathing. My husband suggested we drive around town, check some of the places she liked to hang out. It felt futile, but we had to do something. We got in the car, the gift box with the car keys still sitting forgotten under the Christmas tree. We drove to the local mall, even though it was closed for Christmas. We checked the park where she used to play as a kid. We even drove by her school as if she might be there on Christmas Day. Each empty parking lot, each quiet street felt like another dead end. As we drove, I kept trying her cell phone. Each time it went to voicemail, I left a message, begging her to call us to come home, telling her we weren't angry, we just wanted to know she was safe. My voice cracked more with each message. We decided to drive to the next town over, where her boyfriend lived. We didn't know his exact address, but we thought maybe we'd see her car or catch a glimpse of them. The drive was tense, neither of us speaking much. When we got there, we realized how futile our plan was. It was a decent-sized town, and we had no idea where to start looking. We drove up and down streets aimlessly, hoping for a miracle. After a couple of hours, we decided to head back home. Maybe she had returned while we were out. Maybe there would be a message waiting for us. The drive back felt even longer than the drive there. But when we got home, the house was just as we'd left it. No messages on the answering machine, no texts on our phones. The Christmas tree lights were still on, the presents still untouched. We decided to reach out to some of our relatives. Maybe she had contacted one of them. We called my sister, my husband's brother, our parents. Each call ended the same way. No one had heard from her. Everyone was shocked and worried. As the day wore on, we found ourselves going through her room, looking for clues. We found her passport still in its drawer, which was a small relief. At least she probably hadn't left the country. We checked her computer, but it was password protected. We looked through her drawers and closet, trying to figure out what she might have taken with her. It was hard to tell what was missing. Had she packed a bag, taken warm clothes? We had no idea. The police called back in the afternoon. They hadn't found anything yet, but they were continuing to look. They asked if we had any photos of her they could use. We sent them her most recent school picture. As evening approached, we found ourselves sitting in the living room, staring at the Christmas tree. The presents underneath seemed meaningless now. The car keys, meant to be a symbol of freedom and trust, now felt like a cruel joke. We kept expecting the phone to ring, for her to walk through the door and explain that it had all been a misunderstanding. But as the hours ticked by, that hope began to fade. I was in the kitchen, elbows deep in stuffing a turkey for our Christmas dinner. The house was warm, filled with the smell of cinnamon and nutmeg from the pies I'd baked earlier. I could hear the kids playing in the backyard, their laughter mixing with the sound of Christmas carols from the old radio on the counter. As I reached for the sage, I heard a sudden change in the noise outside. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a high-pitched scream that made me drop the spoon I was holding. It clattered on the floor, but I barely noticed as I rushed towards the back door. I flung the door open and ran out onto the porch. The cold air hit me like a slap, a stark contrast to the cozy warmth of the kitchen. What I saw in the backyard made my blood run cold. My 7-year-old nephew was on the ground, his body jerking uncontrollably. His sister was standing over him screaming, her face pale with fear. The other kids had backed away, staring in horror. I ran down the steps, nearly slipping on a patch of ice. As I got closer, I could see foam forming at the corners of my nephew's mouth. His eyes were rolled back in his head, and his limbs were thrashing against the frozen ground. I knelt beside him, my mind racing. What was happening? Was he having a seizure? I'd never seen anything like this before. I tried to remember what I'd learned about first aid, but everything seemed to blur together. I yelled for someone to call 911, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. I could hear the back door slamming as someone ran inside to make the call. I turned my nephew onto his side, trying to keep him from choking. His skin felt clammy and cold under my hands. I could feel his body convulsing, and I had to fight to keep him in position. As I held him, my eyes darted around, trying to figure out what could have caused this. That's when I saw it, a new toy lying in the snow nearby. It was one of those sticky, stretchy figurines that kids love to play with. But this one was different. It was labeled as extra stretchy, and something about it caught my eye. I reached out and grabbed the toy, bringing it closer to read the packaging. My stomach dropped when I saw the words, "Contains latex," printed in tiny letters on the back. Latex. My nephew was severely allergic to latex. We'd always been so careful, checking everything that came into the house. How had we missed this? I heard the back door slam again, and my sister came running out, phone in hand. She was talking to the 911 operator, her voice shaking as she described what was happening. I could hear the panic in her voice, mirroring the fear that was gripping me. I turned back to my nephew. His convulsions seemed to be getting worse. His lips were turning blue, and I could hear a wheezing sound as he struggled to breathe. I felt utterly helpless, watching him suffer and not knowing how to help. The operator must have told my sister to check for an EpiPen because she suddenly gasped and ran back into the house. I remembered then. We kept one in the kitchen just in case. How could I have forgotten? The seconds felt like hours as we waited for her to return. I kept talking to my nephew, telling him to hang on, that help was coming. I don't know if he could hear me, but I couldn't bear the silence. My sister burst back out of the house, EpiPen in hand. She fumbled with it, hands shaking so badly she could barely remove the cap. I took it from her, somehow managing to stay calm enough to prep the injector. I'd never used an EpiPen before, but I'd seen demonstrations. I pressed it against my nephew's thigh and pushed the button. There was a click and I held it there, counting to 10 like I'd been taught. For a moment, nothing seemed to change. My nephew's body continued to convulse, his breathing still labored. Had I done it wrong? Was it too late? Then gradually, I noticed a change. The convulsions began to slow. His breathing, while still strained, became less erratic. The blue tinge to his lips started to fade. I heard sirens in the distance, growing louder by the second. The sound filled me with both relief and renewed fear. Help was coming, but what if it wasn't enough? As the ambulance pulled up in front of the house, my nephew's eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused, confused but open. He tried to speak, but only a weak moan came out. The paramedics rushed into the backyard carrying bags of equipment. They moved with a speed and efficiency that was almost dizzying. One of them gently moved me aside, taking my place next to my nephew. I stood up, my legs shaky, and watched as they worked. They checked his vitals, listened to his breathing, asked rapid-fire questions that my sister answered as best she could. They quickly decided he needed to go to the hospital. As they prepared him for transport, one of the paramedics asked about the cause of the reaction. I handed over the toy, still clutched in my hand, explaining about the latex. As they lifted my nephew onto a stretcher, his eyes found mine. There was fear in them, confusion, and something else, a plea for reassurance. I tried to smile, to look confident, even as my insides felt like they were twisting into knots. They loaded him into the ambulance, my sister climbing in after him. As the doors closed and the sirens started up again, I stood there in the snow-covered backyard, the sounds of Christmas carols still drifting faintly from the kitchen. The other kids had huddled together on the porch, watching with wide eyes. I knew I needed to go to them, to explain, to comfort. But for a moment I couldn't move. The toy was still in my hand and I stared at it. This innocent-looking thing that had caused so much terror. I finally turned back to the house, my mind already racing ahead to what needed to be done. We'd have to go to the hospital. The turkey sat forgotten in the kitchen, the stuffing bowl still on the counter where I'd left it. As I walked back inside, the warmth of the house felt strange against my cold skin. The Christmas tree lights blinked cheerfully in the living room, a jarring contrast to the fear and panic of the last few minutes. I started moving automatically, turning off the oven, putting away the perishables. My hands were shaking and I nearly dropped a bowl of cranberry sauce. The normalcy of these actions felt surreal after what had just happened. I gathered coats and car keys, trying to think of what else we might need at the hospital. My mind kept replaying the scene in the backyard, my nephew on the ground, his body convulsing, the terrifying moment when I thought the EpiPen hadn't worked. As I herded the other children into the car, I could hear them whispering, asking if their cousin was going to be okay. I wished I had a better answer for them than "I hope so." The drive to the hospital was a blur. I kept checking my phone, hoping for an update from my sister. The streets were nearly empty, most people at home enjoying their Christmas dinners. It felt like we were in a different world entirely. When we arrived at the emergency room, it was bustling with activity. Nurses and doctors moved quickly between curtained-off areas. The antiseptic smell was a sharp contrast to the homey sense of Christmas that had filled the house earlier. We found my sister in the waiting room. She looked up as we approached, her face a mixture of relief and lingering fear. She told us that the doctors were still with our nephew, running tests and monitoring his condition. The phone rang just as I was about to open my first Christmas present. I almost didn't answer it, but something made me reach for my cell. It was my mom's neighbor, and her voice sounded worried. She said she hadn't seen my mom in days. The curtains were still drawn, and newspapers were piling up on the porch. My stomach dropped as I listened. I told my kids to keep opening their gifts and rushed to get dressed. My wife could see the concern on my face and started gathering her things too. We lived about 30 minutes from my mom's place, and every second felt crucial. As we drove, the streets were empty. It was early on Christmas morning, and the world seemed eerily quiet. I kept thinking about my mom, alone in her house. Had she fallen? Was she sick? Why hadn't she called anyone? We pulled up to her house, and I saw exactly what the neighbor had described. 3 days' worth of newspapers were scattered on the porch, and all the curtains were drawn. This wasn't like my mom at all. She always read her paper first thing in the morning and opened the curtains to let in the light. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking as I tried to find the right one. When I finally got the door open, I was hit by a wave of stale air. The house was dark and silent. I called out for my mom, but there was no response. We moved through the house, checking each room. The kitchen looked untouched, with dirty dishes still in the sink. In the living room, the TV remote was on the floor as if it had been dropped. My dread grew with each empty room we found. Then I saw her. She was lying on the floor of her bedroom, partially hidden by the bed. Her eyes were closed, and for a terrifying moment I thought she might be dead. I rushed to her side, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I knelt beside her, gently shaking her shoulder and calling her name. To my immense relief, she stirred slightly and let out a weak groan. She was alive, but clearly in bad shape. Her skin was pale and clammy, and she seemed disoriented. My wife was already on the phone with 911, giving them the address and describing the situation. I tried to make my mom more comfortable, grabbing a pillow from the bed to put under her head. As I moved her slightly, she winced in pain. I noticed her hip was at an odd angle, and I suspected she might have broken it in the fall. I held her hand and tried to keep her calm while we waited for the ambulance. She was having trouble focusing her eyes and seemed confused about what day it was. I realized with horror that she must have been lying there for days, unable to reach her phone to call for help. The wait for the ambulance felt like an eternity. I kept talking to my mom, trying to keep her awake and alert. She was so weak, her voice barely a whisper when she tried to speak. I could see she was dehydrated, her lips dry and cracked. I looked around the room, trying to piece together what had happened. Her walker was on the other side of the room, too far for her to reach from where she had fallen. A glass of water and her medication were on the nightstand, also out of reach. It was a cruel twist of fate. Everything she needed was just a few feet away, but it might as well have been miles. When the paramedics finally arrived, they moved with practiced efficiency. They asked me questions about my mom's medical history as they checked her vital signs. I tried to remember all her medications, kicking myself for not having a better record of them. They confirmed what I had suspected. Her hip was likely broken. They explained that she was severely dehydrated and probably hadn't eaten in days. As they prepared to move her onto a stretcher, I saw her face contort in pain. It was agonizing to watch, knowing she had been suffering alone for so long. As they carried her out of the house, I caught a glimpse of her face in the morning light. She looked so small and frail on the stretcher, nothing like the strong, independent woman I knew. The paramedics were careful as they navigated the porch steps, the same steps she had climbed countless times over the years. I rode in the ambulance with her, holding her hand the whole way. The paramedics worked around me, setting up an IV to start rehydrating her. They asked her questions to assess her mental state, but her answers were slow and often confused. She kept asking if it was still Christmas, seeming distressed that she had ruined the holiday. At the hospital, everything moved in a blur. Doctors and nurses swarmed around, asking questions and running tests. I did my best to answer, all while trying to keep my mom calm. She seemed overwhelmed by all the activity, her eyes darting around in confusion. They took her for x-rays and other scans, confirming the broken hip and checking for other injuries. When they brought her back, a doctor explained that she would need surgery to repair the hip. They also wanted to run more tests to make sure there wasn't an underlying reason for her fall. As we waited for her to be taken to surgery, I sat by her bed, still holding her hand. She drifted in and out of sleep, the pain medication making her groggy. In her more lucid moments, she apologized over and over for ruining Christmas. I assured her that the only thing that mattered was that she was going to be okay. The surgeon came in to explain the procedure. He was kind but direct, outlining the risks and the long recovery process ahead. As he spoke, I couldn't help but think about how different our lives would be after this. My mom had always been fiercely independent, but now she would need help, at least for a while. As they prepared to take her to surgery, I leaned down to kiss her forehead. She squeezed my hand weakly and told me not to worry. Even now, she was trying to be strong for me. I watched as they wheeled her bed out of the room, feeling a mix of fear and hope. In the waiting room, I finally had a moment to process everything that had happened. The morning had started so normally, with the excitement of Christmas, and had turned into this nightmare scenario in the blink of an eye. I thought about how close we had come to losing her, how a simple fall had nearly cost her her life. My wife arrived at the hospital with our kids, all of them looking worried and confused. I did my best to explain what had happened, trying to strike a balance between honesty and not scaring them too much. They hugged me tightly, and I realized how much I needed their support right then. As we settled in for the long wait, I couldn't stop thinking about my mom lying alone on that floor for days, the fear she must have felt, the pain she endured. I promised myself that I would do everything in my power to make sure something like this never happened again. The surgery seemed to take forever. Every time the door to the waiting room opened, I would look up, hoping for news. Nurses came periodically to update us, always saying the same thing: the surgery was progressing as expected. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the surgeon emerged. He looked tired but satisfied. He told us the surgery had gone well, that they had successfully repaired my mom's hip. She was in recovery and would be moved to a room soon. We were all sitting around the Christmas tree, wrapping paper scattered everywhere. The kids were playing with their new toys, and my wife was trying to figure out how to work the new coffee maker I'd gotten her. It was just a normal Christmas morning, you know? The house smelled like cinnamon and pine, and we could hear the neighbors' kids outside, probably testing out their new bikes. I was fiddling with a new gadget when I first noticed it. At first I thought maybe my wife had burned something in the kitchen. It was just a faint smell, kind of acrid. I looked over at her, but she was still focused on that coffee maker. I didn't think much of it, to be honest. Maybe it was coming from outside, I thought. But then the smell got stronger. It wasn't food burning, that was for sure. It smelled like smoke. Real smoke. I put down the gadget and stood up, trying to figure out where it was coming from. That's when I saw it, a thin wisp of smoke curling up from behind the Christmas tree. I moved closer, pushing aside some of the lower branches. There, near the base of the tree, I saw a small flame. It was flickering around one of the light sockets, where the wires connected to the plug. My stomach dropped. I yelled for my wife to bring the fire extinguisher. She must have heard the panic in my voice because she came running, the kids right behind her. When they saw the flame, the kids started screaming. My wife ran to get the extinguisher from the kitchen while I tried to unplug the lights. The plug was hot to the touch and I had to yank it out quickly. I thought that would solve it, you know? Just unplug it and the fire would go out. But it didn't. Instead, the flame seemed to grow, feeding on the plastic of the artificial tree. By the time my wife got back with the extinguisher, the fire had already spread to several branches. I grabbed the extinguisher and aimed it at the base of the fire, just like they teach you. But as soon as the foam hit the flames, there was a loud pop and a shower of sparks. The fire seemed to explode outward, engulfing more of the tree in seconds. The heat was intense. I could feel it on my face as I backed away. The kids were crying now, and my wife was trying to calm them down. I yelled at them to get out of the house, to go to the neighbors. The smoke was getting thicker, making it hard to see and breathe. I made one last attempt to fight the fire, spraying the extinguisher until it was empty, but it was like trying to put out a bonfire with a water gun. The flames were climbing higher, reaching the ceiling now. The curtains nearby caught fire, and suddenly half the living room was ablaze. I knew we had to get out. The smoke was so thick I could barely see. I grabbed my youngest, who was frozen in fear, and pushed my wife and older child towards the front door. We were coughing, stumbling through the smoke-filled hallway. As we reached the door, I realized my wife wasn't with us. I handed the kid to my older child and told them to go to the neighbor's house. Then I turned back, calling for my wife. I couldn't see her through the smoke, but I heard her coughing somewhere in the living room. I dropped to my knees where the air was a little clearer and crawled back towards the living room. The heat was unbearable. I could hear the fire roaring, the sound of things breaking and falling. I found my wife near the couch, trying to grab photo albums. I pulled her away, telling her we had to leave now. She was reluctant, reaching for the albums again, but I practically dragged her towards the door. We could barely breathe, the smoke burning our lungs with every breath. We stumbled out the front door just as we heard a loud crash from inside. Looking back, we saw that part of the ceiling had collapsed where we had been standing just moments before. The realization of how close we'd come to being trapped hit me like a punch to the gut. We ran to where the kids were standing with the neighbors, all of us coughing and gasping for air. As we turned to look at the house, we saw flames shooting out of the windows. The beautiful home we'd lived in for years, decorated for Christmas just days ago, was now a raging inferno. Someone had called 911, and we could hear sirens in the distance. But even as the fire trucks pulled up, I knew it was too late. The fire had spread too quickly, engulfed too much. We watched helpless as the firefighters battled the blaze. The heat was so intense we had to back up further down the street. Neighbors were coming out of their houses, staring in shock. Some brought us blankets, others offered us water. But all I could focus on was our home, everything we owned, going up in flames. The firefighters worked tirelessly, but the fire seemed to have a life of its own. Every time they seemed to get it under control in one area, it would flare up in another. The smoke was billowing high into the sky, visible for miles around. As the hours passed, the reality of what was happening began to sink in. All our Christmas presents, our clothes, our furniture, our memories, everything was being destroyed. The kids' baby books, our wedding album, family heirlooms passed down for generations, all gone. The fire chief came to talk to us at one point. He asked about how the fire started, and I told him about the lights on the tree. He nodded grimly, saying they see a lot of Christmas tree fires this time of year. But the scale of this one, how quickly it had spread, was unusual. As the day wore on, more and more people gathered to watch. News vans showed up, reporters trying to get interviews. But we were in no state to talk. We just stood there, wrapped in borrowed blankets, watching our life go up in smoke. It was late afternoon by the time the firefighters finally got the blaze under control. But by then, there was nothing left to save. Our house, the place where we'd built our life, raised our kids, celebrated countless Christmases, was nothing but a charred, smoking ruin. The fire chief came back to us, his face grave. He told us that the house was a total loss. There was nothing salvageable. He asked if we had somewhere to stay, and our neighbors immediately offered to take us in. As the fire trucks began to pack up and leave, we were left staring at the smoldering remains of our home. The Christmas tree that had been the center of our celebration that morning was now just a blackened skeleton. Bits of melted ornaments and charred gifts were scattered among the debris. The reality of what had happened was starting to hit us. We had lost everything. Every possession, every memento, every piece of our history, gone in a matter of hours. And it had all started with a simple string of Christmas lights. I was setting up my laptop on the kitchen table, getting ready for our annual Christmas morning video call with my brother and his family. They live on the other side of the country, so this had become our tradition over the past few years. I could hear my kids in the living room already tearing into their stockings, and my wife was making coffee. As I opened up the video chat app, I noticed my hands were a bit jittery from all the coffee I'd already had. It was early, and we'd been up late the night before finishing up the Santa duties. I clicked on my brother's name and waited for the connection to go through. When the video popped up, I saw my brother's living room. Their Christmas tree was in the background, all lit up and surrounded by wrapped presents. I could hear the excited voices of my niece and nephew before I even saw them. My brother's face appeared on the screen, grinning and waving. He looked tired too, but happy. He turned the camera around to show the kids who were bouncing up and down in their pajamas, clearly amped up on Christmas excitement. My sister-in-law was in the background, arranging some last-minute things under the tree. It all looked so normal, so familiar. Just another Christmas morning. We chatted for a bit, catching up on the last-minute Christmas Eve stuff we'd both been doing. The kids were getting impatient, so my brother started handing out presents. I watched as my niece unwrapped a new bike helmet, and my nephew got some kind of science kit. It was nice seeing their excited faces even if I couldn't be there in person. As my nephew was opening another gift, I noticed something odd. My brother was rubbing his temple, kind of squinting. At first I thought maybe he was just tired or had a bit of a headache from all the excitement, but then he did it again, this time pressing his whole hand against the side of his head. I was about to ask if he was okay when he suddenly went pale, like really pale. His eyes got wide and he looked, I don't know, scared, confused. Before I could say anything, he clutched his head with both hands and made this sound. It wasn't quite a scream, more like a groan, but it was loud enough that everyone in the room turned to look at him. And then, just like that, he collapsed. 1 second he was sitting there, and the next, he was gone from the frame. I heard a thud and then my sister-in-law screaming. The camera fell over or got knocked down in the commotion, and suddenly all I could see was a sideways view of their living room rug and the base of the Christmas tree. I was yelling at the screen, asking what was happening, if he was okay, but I don't think anyone could hear me. All I could hear was chaos. My sister-in-law yelling for someone to call 911, the kids crying, and this awful gasping sound that I realized must be coming from my brother. I felt completely helpless. Here I was, thousands of miles away, watching this nightmare unfold through a tiny laptop screen, and there was absolutely nothing I could do. I couldn't even see what was happening anymore, just that patch of rug and the sound of panic. I yelled for my wife to come, trying to explain what was happening. She rushed over and we both stared at the screen, straining to understand what was going on. We could hear my sister-in-law talking to someone, probably a 911 operator, her voice shaky as she described what had happened. The next few minutes were agonizing. We couldn't see anything, but we could hear everything. The kids were still crying, and I could hear my sister-in-law's voice, sometimes talking to the 911 operator, sometimes trying to comfort the kids, sometimes talking to my brother. His responses, when I could hear them, were slurred and confused. Then we heard new voices. The paramedics had arrived. There was a flurry of activity, questions being asked and answered rapidly. I heard terms like sudden onset and possible stroke being thrown around. My stomach was in knots. This couldn't be happening. Not on Christmas morning. Not to my brother. Someone must have remembered the video call was still going because suddenly the camera was picked up. For a brief moment, I saw the scene. Paramedics were kneeling next to my brother, who was lying on the floor. His eyes were open, but he looked wrong. His face was drooping on one side, and he seemed to be struggling to focus. My sister-in-law's face appeared on the screen. She looked terrified but was trying to stay calm. She quickly explained that they were taking him to the hospital, that it might be a stroke or an aneurysm. She promised to call as soon as they knew anything and then ended the call. And just like that, the screen went black. 1 minute I'd been watching my niece and nephew open Christmas presents, and the next, my brother was being rushed to the hospital with a possible brain aneurysm. The sudden silence in my kitchen was deafening. My wife and I just sat there staring at the blank screen. Our own kids were still in the living room, oblivious to what had just happened, excited about their presents. But for us, Christmas had just turned into a nightmare. I kept replaying the scene in my head, the way he'd rubbed his temple, how quickly he'd gone pale. Should I have noticed something sooner? Could I have done anything if I had? The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. My brother was fighting for his life on the other side of the country, and all I could do was wait for a phone call. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. We went through the motions of opening presents with our kids, trying to keep things normal for them. But my mind was constantly on my brother, wondering what was happening in that hospital so far away. It wasn't until later that afternoon that we finally got an update. My sister-in-law called. her voice exhausted. She confirmed what we had feared. It had been an aneurysm. My brother was in surgery. The doctors were doing everything they could, but it was too soon to know what the outcome would be. The kids were already outside when I finished my coffee. It was Christmas morning and they couldn't wait to try out their new trampoline. I could hear their excited shouts through the kitchen window as I rinsed out my mug. I grabbed my coat and headed out to the backyard. The air was crisp and my breath came out in little puffs of white. The grass crunched under my feet. It had frozen overnight. I made a mental note to be careful. The ground was like concrete. The trampoline was set up near the back fence. We'd spent hours putting it together the night before after the kids had gone to bed. It was one of those big ones with a safety net all around it. I'd insisted on that, figuring it would keep the kids from bouncing off. As I approached, I could see all three of them jumping. My oldest was doing these elaborate flips, showing off for the younger ones. The middle child was trying to copy him, with limited success. And then there was my youngest, just bouncing up and down with the biggest grin on his face. I stood there watching them for a while, sipping my coffee. They were having so much fun it was hard not to smile. But there was this nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something about the way they were bouncing so close to the edge of the trampoline made me nervous. I called out to them to be careful, to stay in the middle. They nodded and waved, but I could tell they weren't really listening. They were too caught up in the excitement of their new toy. I was just about to head back inside when I saw it happen. My youngest was bouncing near the edge, right by the opening in the safety net. He went up for a jump, arms outstretched, laughing. But when he came down, his foot caught the edge of the trampoline. It was like everything slowed down. I saw his eyes widen in surprise as he lost his balance. He teetered for a moment on the edge of the trampoline, arms windmilling. Then he fell backwards right through the opening in the net. I started running before he even hit the ground. But it felt like I was moving through molasses. I saw his head connect with the frozen earth, heard the sickening thud. His body went limp instantly. By the time I reached him, the other kids were already screaming. I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands shaking as I reached out to touch him. He was so still, too still. His eyes were closed and there was already a lump forming on the back of his head. I called his name, gently at first, then more urgently. I tapped his cheeks, trying to get a response. Nothing. My mind was racing, trying to remember everything I'd ever learned about first aid. Should I move him? Should I leave him where he was? I yelled for my wife to call 911. I could hear her voice, high and panicked, as she talked to the dispatcher. The other kids were crying now, hovering uncertainly nearby. I tried to reassure them, to tell them everything would be okay, but the words felt hollow in my mouth. I kept talking to my youngest, pleading with him to wake up. I checked his breathing, relieved to see his chest rising and falling, but he wouldn't open his eyes. The minutes stretched on endlessly as we waited for the ambulance. When the paramedics arrived, they moved with a calm efficiency that I envied. They asked me questions. How long had he been unconscious? Did I see him fall? Had he moved at all since the accident? I answered as best I could, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. They stabilized his neck and carefully lifted him onto a stretcher. One of them mentioned something about a possible concussion, maybe worse. They said we needed to get him to the hospital right away for scans. The ride to the hospital was a blur. I sat in the back of the ambulance, holding my son's hand. The paramedic kept checking his vital signs, attaching wires and monitors. The siren wailed overhead, but all I could focus on was my little boy's face, willing him to open his eyes. When we arrived at the ER, things moved quickly. They whisked him away for immediate tests, leaving me standing in the waiting room, feeling lost and scared. My wife arrived a few minutes later with the other kids. We huddled together, waiting for news. The wait seemed endless. Doctors and nurses rushed by, but no one could tell us anything. I kept replaying the fall in my mind, wondering if I could have prevented it somehow, if I had just gone inside a few minutes earlier, or if I had been stricter about the safety rules. Finally, a doctor came out to talk to us. They had done a CT scan and found some swelling in his brain. They were concerned about the possibility of a traumatic brain injury. They needed to keep him for observation and might need to perform surgery if the swelling didn't go down. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Surgery? On Christmas Day? This couldn't be happening. It was supposed to be a day of celebration, of family time. Instead, we were in a sterile hospital room, waiting to see if our son would be okay. They let us see him briefly before they took him up to the pediatric ICU. He looked so small in the hospital bed, hooked up to all those machines. His face was pale, with a large bruise forming where he had hit his head. I wanted to gather him up in my arms, to make everything better. But all I could do was stand there, holding his hand and praying he would wake up. The next few hours were a nightmare of waiting and worrying. The nurses came in regularly to check his vitals and his neurological responses. They explained that they were monitoring the pressure in his brain, watching for any signs that the swelling was getting worse. I couldn't stop thinking about how quickly everything had changed. Just that morning, we had been a normal family celebrating Christmas. Now we were facing the possibility of brain surgery and long-term effects we couldn't even begin to comprehend. As the day wore on, the doctors became increasingly concerned about the swelling in his brain. They explained that if it didn't start to decrease soon, they would need to perform a procedure to relieve the pressure. The thought of them drilling into my little boy's skull was almost more than I could bear. We sat by his bedside talking to him, pleading with him to wake up. The other kids were with relatives, probably opening the rest of their Christmas presents. But for us, everything had narrowed down to this hospital room, to the steady beep of the heart monitor and the rise and fall of our son's chest. Late in the afternoon, one of the nurses noticed a change in his readings. She called for the doctor, and suddenly the room was full of medical staff. They were examining him, calling out numbers and medical terms I didn't understand. I stood in the corner, my wife clutching my hand, both of us terrified of what was happening. The doctor turned to us with a grave expression. The swelling in our son's brain wasn't subsiding. They needed to take him into surgery immediately to relieve the pressure. If they didn't, the damage could be permanent or worse. Everything after that happened in a rush. They were preparing him for surgery, explaining the risks and the procedure. We had to sign consent forms, our hands shaking as we scribbled our signatures, and then they were wheeling him away, down the long hospital corridor towards the operating room. As the doors swung shut behind them, cutting off our last view of our little boy, the full weight of the situation crashed down on me. Our Christmas miracle now hinged on the skill of the surgeons and the strength of our son's young body. All we could do was wait and hope and pray that when those doors opened again, they would bring good news. I got up early on Christmas morning to start breakfast. The house was quiet and I could see the lights from our tree reflecting in the window. I headed to the kitchen, thinking about the cinnamon rolls I was going to make. My husband and our youngest were still asleep, but I expected our teenager to be up soon. He always got up early on Christmas, even now that he was older. As I passed the bathroom, I noticed the door was closed. I figured my son had gotten up early and was in there. I knocked lightly, not wanting to startle him. No answer. I knocked again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. Something felt off. He usually answered right away. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. I pushed the door open slowly, calling out to him. The light was on, but as the door swung open, I saw him. He was lying on the floor, face down. At first, I thought he had fallen. I rushed in, calling his name. That's when I saw the pill bottles. They were scattered around him on the tile floor. Some were empty, tipped over on their sides. Others still had a few pills left in them. I recognized the orange prescription bottles immediately. They were mine, my husband's, even some left over from when my mother had stayed with us during her cancer treatments. I dropped to my knees beside him, rolling him over. His skin was pale, almost gray. His lips had a bluish tint. I put my hand on his chest, desperate to feel it rise and fall. There was movement, but it was shallow, barely there. I shook him, called his name, but his eyes remained closed. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what had happened. How long had he been here? When did he take the pills? Why didn't we hear anything? The questions came flooding in, but I pushed them aside. I needed to act. I ran to our bedroom shouting for my husband to wake up. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and dialed 911. The operator's voice seemed far away as I explained what I had found. She asked me questions. Was he breathing? Was he responsive? How long had he been like this? I answered as best I could, my voice shaking. Back in the bathroom, my husband was kneeling beside our son. He looked up at me, his face a mask of confusion and fear. The operator was still on the line, telling me help was on the way. She instructed us to turn him on his side, into the recovery position. We did as she said, our movements clumsy with panic. The wait for the ambulance felt endless. Every second stretched out, filled with the sound of our son's labored breathing. I kept my fingers on his wrist, counting his pulse. It was there, but weak and irregular. The operator stayed on the line with us, her calm voice a lifeline in the chaos. I could hear sirens in the distance, growing louder. My husband ran downstairs to open the front door. I stayed with our son, watching his face for any sign of consciousness. There was none. Just that awful stillness, broken only by his shallow breaths. The paramedics arrived like a whirlwind of action. They filled our small bathroom, asking questions rapid fire as they worked. I showed them the pill bottles, trying to remember what medications they were, how many might have been in each. They nodded, their faces grim. They started an IV, attached monitors. Numbers and medical terms flew back and forth between them. I caught phrases like respiratory depression and possible organ damage. Each word felt like a physical blow. How could this be happening? It was Christmas morning. We were supposed to be opening presents, not watching our son fight for his life. They moved him onto a stretcher. As they carried him out, I caught a glimpse of our Christmas tree, the presents still wrapped underneath. The sight was jarring, so normal amidst the nightmare we were living. My husband stayed behind to watch our younger child, who was mercifully still asleep. I climbed into the ambulance with our son. The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and siren wails. The paramedics worked constantly, adjusting IVs, checking vitals. One of them asked me questions about our son's medical history. Any allergies? If he'd ever done anything like this before. I answered mechanically, my eyes fixed on my son's face, willing him to open his eyes. At the hospital, they rushed him straight into the emergency room. I tried to follow, but a nurse gently held me back. She led me to a small waiting area, promised to update me as soon as they knew anything. I sat there, still in my pajamas, suddenly aware of the Christmas-themed scrubs the staff were wearing. The cheerful Santas and reindeer seemed to mock the gravity of our situation. Time lost all meaning. Doctors and nurses came and went, each time asking me to recount what had happened, what pills I thought he might have taken. I answered the same questions over and over, my voice growing hoarse. My husband arrived at some point. Our younger child left with a neighbor. We sat together, hands clasped, waiting. Finally, a doctor came to speak with us. He explained that they had pumped our son's stomach and were giving him activated charcoal to absorb any remaining drugs. They were monitoring his heart and organs for damage. The next 24 to 48 hours would be critical. They were moving him to the ICU for close observation. We were allowed to see him briefly before they took him upstairs. He was pale against the white hospital sheets, tubes and wires everywhere. A machine breathed for him, the rhythmic hiss a constant reminder of how close we'd come to losing him. I wanted to gather him in my arms like I had when he was small, to protect him from the world, from himself. But all I could do was stand there, watching the monitors, praying for some sign of improvement. In the ICU, the waiting continued. Nurses came in regularly to check his vitals, adjust medications. They explained that they were working to stabilize him, to counter the effects of the overdose. Each time they came, I searched their faces for some sign, some hint that things were improving, but their expressions remained neutral, professional. As the day wore on, more family arrived. They gathered in the waiting room, a surreal Christmas reunion. I could hear them talking in hushed voices, could feel their concerned glances. but I couldn't bring myself to leave our son's side. Every beep of the heart monitor, every hiss of the ventilator, held me there. The doctors came in periodically to update us. They were cautiously optimistic, they said. His vital signs were stabilizing, but they were concerned about potential organ damage, particularly to his liver and kidneys. They ordered more tests, more scans. Each piece of information was a double-edged sword, relief that he was still fighting, fear of what long-term damage might have been done. As evening approached, a nurse came in to check his neurological responses. She called his name, tested his reflexes. For the first time, there was a flicker of response. His fingers twitched when she rubbed his sternum. It was small, but it was something. The first tangible sign that our son was still in there, still fighting. The nurse smiled at us, a genuine warmth in her eyes. She told us this was a good sign, that these responses were what they were looking for. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But maybe, just maybe, we'd gotten to him in time. As night fell, the hospital settled into a quieter rhythm. The constant beep of monitors and hiss of machines became a sort of white noise. I sat by our son's bed, holding his hand, watching for any sign of movement. My husband dozed in a chair nearby, exhaustion finally overtaking him. I found myself talking to our son in whispers, pleading with him to keep fighting, to come back to us. I promised him we'd get through this together, that we'd get him whatever help he needed. I apologized for not seeing his pain sooner, for not preventing this somehow. The words poured out of me, a mix of prayer and confession and desperate hope. We were all gathered around the Christmas tree, unwrapping gifts and laughing. It was one of those picture-perfect family moments, you know? The kind you see in movies. My dad was sitting in his favorite armchair, right next to the tree. He always insisted on being the one to hand out the presents, even though he was getting older. I remember noticing that he was quieter than usual. At first, I didn't think much of it. He'd been complaining about feeling tired lately, and with all the holiday preparations, I figured he was just taking a moment to rest. But then I saw him reach for another gift, and something seemed off about the way he was moving. His hand was sort of fumbling, like he couldn't quite grasp the package properly. I watched him for a moment, this uneasy feeling starting to grow in the pit of my stomach. He finally managed to pick up the gift, but when he tried to read the name tag, his words came out all slurred. Everyone kind of stopped what they were doing and looked at him. There was this moment of confused silence. You could see people trying to process what was happening. My mom asked him if he was okay, but his response was garbled. That's when I noticed his face. The right side seemed to be drooping slightly. It was like time slowed down. I'd seen those commercials about stroke symptoms, you know? The ones that tell you to act fast. Face drooping, arm weakness, speech difficulties, time to call 911. It was like a checklist going off in my head, and my dad was ticking all the boxes. I stood up, probably too quickly because I knocked over a pile of wrapping paper. I told everyone I thought Dad was having a stroke. The room erupted into a flurry of activity. My brother was already on the phone with 911, speaking rapidly into the receiver. My mom rushed to my dad's side, trying to get him to respond clearly. The 911 operator was giving instructions, which my brother was relaying to us. We needed to get my dad to lie down flat to make sure he didn't fall and hurt himself. But moving him from the chair was a struggle. His right side seemed weak and he couldn't really help us. It took 3 of us to carefully lower him to the floor. The operator asked if we could give him an aspirin to help thin his blood. My sister ran to the kitchen to find some, rummaging through drawers and cabinets. The sound of her frantic searching was this weird backdrop to the tense scene in the living room. I was kneeling next to my dad, holding his hand, trying to keep him calm. His eyes were darting around and I could see the fear in them. He was trying to speak, but the words were coming out jumbled. I kept telling him it would be okay, that help was on the way, but I'm not sure he could understand me. We could hear sirens in the distance, and there was this moment of relief. But then they seemed to be getting fainter instead of louder. We looked at each other in confusion. My brother, still on the phone, suddenly exclaimed that the ambulance was stuck. Apparently, the heavy snowfall from the night before had left the roads in a mess. The ambulance had tried to take a shortcut down our street but had gotten stuck in a snowdrift. They were trying to get out, but it was going to take some time. Panic started to set in. We knew that with a stroke, every minute counts. The longer it took to get treatment, the worse the damage could be. We started discussing whether we should try to take him to the hospital ourselves. But the roads were bad, and we were worried about moving him. My brother-in-law decided to go out and see if he could help the ambulance crew. He grabbed a shovel and ran out into the snow. Through the window, I could see him frantically digging, trying to clear a path. Other neighbors started coming out to help, alerted by the sound of the stuck ambulance. Inside, we were doing everything the 911 operator suggested. Keeping Dad comfortable, monitoring his breathing, making sure he didn't lose consciousness, but it felt like we were just waiting, helpless as precious minutes ticked by. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we heard the ambulance making its way down our street. The paramedics rushed in, their uniforms covered in snow. They immediately started assessing my dad, asking us questions about when the symptoms started, what we'd observed. They worked quickly, attaching monitors, starting an IV. They confirmed what we already knew. It looked like a stroke. They needed to get him to the hospital as soon as possible for a CT scan and possible clot-busting drugs. Getting him out of the house was another challenge. The stretcher couldn't make it through the snow-covered path, so they had to use a special chair to carry him out. We watched as they carefully maneuvered him down our icy front steps and into the ambulance. Only one of us could ride in the ambulance, so my mom went. The rest of us scrambled to get our coats and shoes, preparing to follow in our cars. As we were getting ready, I glanced back at the living room. The half-unwrapped presents, the discarded wrapping paper, my dad's empty chair. It was such a stark contrast to the joyful scene from just an hour before. The drive to the hospital was tense. The roads were still in bad condition, and we had to drive slowly. I kept thinking about the ambulance ahead of us, hoping they were able to make better time. Every minute felt crucial. When we finally arrived at the emergency room, it was chaos. The holiday had left them short-staffed, and the bad weather had caused a number of accidents. We found my mom in the waiting area, looking shell-shocked. She said they had taken Dad back immediately for tests. We waited for what felt like hours, watching doctors and nurses rush back and forth. Every time someone in scrubs walked by, we'd all look up, hoping for news. But no one stopped to talk to us. Finally, a doctor came out. He explained that they had confirmed it was an ischemic stroke, a clot blocking blood flow to part of my dad's brain. They were prepping him for a procedure to try to remove the clot. The doctor stressed that the delay in getting to the hospital might impact the effectiveness of the treatment, but they were going to do everything they could. As they wheeled my dad away for the procedure, I caught a glimpse of him. He looked small and vulnerable on the hospital bed, so different from the strong, vibrant man who had been handing out presents just hours before. The last thing I saw was his face, still drooping on one side, as the doors to the treatment area swung shut. I was in the living room setting up my son's new gaming console. He'd been begging for it for months, and we finally got it for him as a Christmas present. The excitement on his face when he opened it was priceless. I promised I'd have it ready for him to play after dinner, so there I was, surrounded by cables and instruction manuals, trying to figure out which plug went where. I had just managed to get everything connected and was about to turn it on when suddenly, the whole house went dark. At first I thought maybe I had overloaded a circuit or something. I mean, I'm not exactly an electronics expert. But then I realized that even the street lights outside were off. It wasn't just our house. It seemed like the whole neighborhood had lost power. I fumbled around in the dark, trying to find my phone to use as a flashlight. I could hear my wife and son moving around upstairs, probably wondering what was going on. I called out to them, saying I'd go check the circuit breaker in the basement. It was probably nothing, I thought. Maybe a blown fuse or something simple like that. I made my way to the basement door, using my phone's flashlight to guide me. As I opened the door, I noticed something odd. There was this smell. It was faint at first, but as I started down the stairs, it got stronger. It was a nasty, sewage-like odor that made me wrinkle my nose. I reached the bottom of the stairs and shined my light around. That's when I saw it. The basement floor was covered in water. But this wasn't clean water from a burst pipe or something. No, this was dark, murky, and it stank. My stomach turned as I realized what I was looking at: sewage. Our basement was flooded with sewage. I took a step forward, and the water came up to my ankles. It was cold and thick, and I could feel things floating in it, bumping against my legs. I tried not to think about what those things might be. I needed to get to the circuit breaker to see if that's what had caused the power outage. As I waded through the filthy water, I could hear a gurgling sound. It was coming from the far corner of the basement. I pointed my light in that direction and saw that the main sewage pipe had burst. Raw sewage was pouring out of it, adding to the disgusting pool I was standing in. I felt a wave of panic. This wasn't just a simple power outage or a bit of flooding. This was a major disaster. Our entire house was at risk. I needed to get my family out and call for help. I turned to head back upstairs, but as I did, I slipped on something in the water. I fell backward, and for a horrifying moment I was completely submerged in the sewage. The stench filled my nose and mouth. I scrambled to my feet, gagging and spitting, trying desperately to wipe the filth from my face. I rushed up the stairs, calling for my wife and son. I told them we needed to get out of the house right away. I could hear the panic in my own voice as I explained what was happening in the basement. My wife grabbed some towels and started stuffing them under the door, trying to keep the sewage from seeping into the rest of the house. I ran to get my phone and call for help. But who do you even call for something like this? The water company? A plumber? 911? I decided to start with our home insurance company. Maybe they could guide us on what to do next. As I was on hold with the insurance company, I heard a loud crash from the basement. My wife and I exchanged terrified looks. I handed her the phone and cautiously opened the basement door. The smell that hit me was even worse than before. I shined my light down the stairs and saw that the water level had risen significantly. It was now halfway up the stairs. I slammed the door shut and told my wife and son to grab whatever they could carry. We needed to leave now. The sewage was rising faster than I had anticipated, and I was afraid it would soon start flooding the ground floor. We rushed out of the house, and I immediately went to warn our neighbors. As I was knocking on doors, I could see that other houses on our street were having similar issues. People were coming out of their homes, looking confused and scared. It turned out that a main sewer line for our neighborhood had collapsed, causing a massive backup. The heavy rains we'd had recently had overwhelmed the already weakened system, and now we were all paying the price. I spent the next few hours coordinating with neighbors, talking to city officials, and trying to get some kind of emergency response. The smell was overwhelming, and you could see raw sewage bubbling up from manholes all down the street. Emergency services were overwhelmed. They told us it could be hours before they could get to us. In the meantime, the sewage continued to rise. I went back to check on our house and was horrified to see that it had now reached the ground floor. Our beautiful hardwood floors were submerged in inches of filthy water. I tried to salvage what I could, wading through the muck to grab important documents and irreplaceable items. The whole time I was terrified of what kinds of bacteria and contaminants I was exposing myself to. But what choice did I have? This was our home, our life, being destroyed before our eyes. As night fell, the situation only got worse. The power was still out, and now we had the added challenge of navigating this disaster in the dark. The temperature was dropping and we had nowhere to go. Hotels in the area were quickly filling up with other displaced families. We ended up sleeping in our car that night, parked on higher ground a few blocks away. I couldn't sleep though. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the rising water. Imagine the damage being done to our home. Early the next morning, I went back to check on the house. The water had receded somewhat, but the damage was catastrophic. Everything on the ground floor was ruined. The smell was overpowering, and I could see a layer of sludge covering every surface. The city finally managed to get the sewer line repaired later that day, but the aftermath was just beginning. We were told it wasn't safe to enter our home. The levels of bacteria and contaminants were dangerously high. We needed professional cleaning and sanitizing before we could even think about moving back in. I stood there, looking at our house, trying to process what had happened. Just yesterday, I had been setting up a game console, looking forward to seeing my son's face light up when he played it. Now that console, along with so many other things, was buried somewhere in that toxic sludge. Our home, which had always felt like a safe haven, had been violated in the most disgusting way possible. The cleanup crews arrived, dressed in hazmat suits. They looked like something out of a sci-fi movie, but this was our new reality. They started the process of pumping out the contaminated water, warning us that it would take days, maybe even weeks, before our home would be habitable again. As I watched them work, the full impact of what we were facing started to sink in. This wasn't just about replacing some furniture or repainting some walls. This was a biohazard situation. Everything the sewage had touched would need to be thoroughly decontaminated or, more likely, thrown away. I thought about all the things we'd lost. Photo albums, family heirlooms, my son's artwork from school. Things that couldn't be replaced. And then there were the potential health risks. Had we been exposed to dangerous pathogens? Would there be long-term consequences from this exposure? The insurance adjuster arrived, and as we walked through the house cataloging the damage, I felt numb. He was talking about coverage limits and deductibles, but all I could focus on was the devastation around me. The wallpaper was peeling off in soggy sheets. There was a layer of scum on every surface, and the smell. God, the smell was unbearable. I was in the kitchen, mixing pancake batter for our traditional Christmas morning breakfast. The smell of coffee filled the air, and I could hear my husband and our 5-year-old son in the living room, excitedly discussing the presents Santa had left. It was one of those perfect family moments, you know? The kind you wish you could freeze in time. I poured the first batch of pancakes onto the griddle, watching as they bubbled and turned golden brown. My son came running into the kitchen, asking if they were ready yet. I told him just a few more minutes and sent him back to set the table with his dad. Finally, everything was ready. We sat down at the table, passing around the syrup and butter. My son was practically bouncing in his seat, eager to dig into his stack of pancakes. I watched as he took his first big bite, smiling at the look of pure joy on his face. But then, something changed. His eyes widened and he made a strange choking sound. At first I thought he was just being silly, pretending to choke like kids sometimes do. But then I saw the panic in his eyes, and I knew this was real. I jumped up from my chair, knocking it over in my haste. I asked him if he was choking, but he couldn't respond. He just looked at me, his eyes growing wider by the second. I moved behind him and started performing the Heimlich maneuver, just like I'd learned in that first aid class years ago. I wrapped my arms around his little body and thrust upward, trying to dislodge whatever was stuck in his throat. Nothing happened. I tried again, harder this time. Still nothing. My husband was on his feet now, hovering nearby, unsure of what to do. I could feel my son's body starting to go limp in my arms. His face was turning a sickening shade of blue. The Heimlich wasn't working and I was running out of options. I looked at my husband, silently pleading for help. He snapped into action, grabbing the phone and dialing 911. I could hear him frantically explaining the situation, his voice cracking with fear. The operator was saying something about an ambulance being on its way, but it all sounded far away and muffled. I kept trying the Heimlich, my arms aching from the effort. My son's eyes were starting to roll back in his head. The pancake was lodged too tightly and nothing I was doing was helping. I felt utterly helpless watching my child suffocate right in front of me. My husband hung up the phone and came over. He tried the Heimlich himself, his larger frame allowing him to apply more force. But still, nothing changed. Our son was barely conscious now, his lips a deep shade of blue. That's when my husband made a decision that would haunt me forever. He looked at me and said he was going to have to do an emergency tracheotomy. I didn't even know he knew how to do that. He told me to hold our son still and ran to the kitchen. He came back with a sharp kitchen knife and a drinking straw. My brain couldn't process what was happening. This couldn't be real. This kind of thing happens in movies, not in real life. Not on Christmas morning in your own dining room. My husband told me to lay our son on the floor. His body was so limp, so lifeless. I cradled his head in my lap, stroking his hair, trying to offer some comfort even though I wasn't sure he could feel it anymore. I watched in horror as my husband felt along our son's neck, looking for the right spot. He hesitated for just a moment, then made a small incision. There was blood, more blood than I expected. It ran down our son's neck, staining his Christmas pajamas. My husband worked quickly, his hands steady despite the gravity of the situation. He inserted the straw into the incision he'd made. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then suddenly, I heard a whoosh of air. Our son's chest started to rise and fall. The blue tinge began to fade from his lips. He was breathing. It was shallow and ragged, but he was breathing. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My husband had actually done it. He'd saved our son's life with a kitchen knife and a drinking straw. We could hear sirens in the distance growing louder. My husband kept his finger on our son's neck, holding the straw in place. I just sat there stroking our son's hair, watching his chest rise and fall, afraid to move or speak in case it somehow broke the spell and he stopped breathing again. The paramedics burst through the door, their arrival shattering the eerie calm that had settled over the room. They took in the scene quickly. The overturned chairs, the abandoned breakfast, our son on the floor with a straw sticking out of his neck. They moved us aside gently but firmly. One of them praised my husband for his quick thinking while the others worked on stabilizing our son. They had proper medical equipment, things designed for this kind of emergency. They replaced the makeshift breathing tube with a real one, checked his vitals and prepared him for transport. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, I caught a glimpse of his face. His eyes were open now, darting around in confusion and fear. I wanted to go to him, to tell him everything would be okay, but the paramedics were already moving towards the door. My husband and I followed them out to the ambulance. The Christmas lights on our house were still twinkling, an oddly cheerful backdrop to the nightmare we were living. One of the paramedics told us only one of us could ride in the ambulance. My husband squeezed my hand and nodded for me to go. As I climbed into the ambulance, I looked back at our house. Through the window I could see our Christmas tree, the presents still unopened underneath. The table was still set for breakfast, pancakes growing cold on the plates. It was like looking at a snapshot of the life we'd been living just an hour ago, a life that now felt a million miles away. The doors of the ambulance closed and we sped off towards the hospital. I sat next to my son, holding his hand, watching the paramedics work. They were speaking in medical terms I didn't understand, monitoring machines whose beeps and whirs seemed ominous and alien. I couldn't stop staring at the tube in my son's throat. It looked so wrong, so out of place in his small body. But I knew that without my husband's desperate action, our son wouldn't be here at all. The thought made me feel dizzy and nauseous. The trip to the hospital seemed to take forever and no time at all. Before I knew it, we were pulling up to the emergency entrance. The back doors flew open and a team of doctors and nurses were there, ready to take over. They whisked my son away, rattling off vital signs and medical jargon. I tried to follow, but a nurse gently held me back. She led me to a waiting area, promising to update me as soon as they knew anything. And just like that, I was alone. I sat in that sterile waiting room, still wearing my pajamas, flecks of dried blood on my hands. The cheerful Christmas music playing softly in the background seemed like a cruel joke. How could the world just go on like normal when my whole world had been turned upside down? Time seemed to lose all meaning. I couldn't tell if I'd been sitting there for minutes or hours. Other people came and went, but I barely noticed them. All I could think about was my son, wondering what was happening behind those swinging doors. Finally, a doctor came out to speak with me. He explained that they had successfully removed the blockage, a large piece of pancake that had gotten lodged in my son's airway. They were amazed at the home tracheotomy, saying it had undoubtedly saved his life. Without that makeshift airway, he wouldn't have made it to the hospital. Hey there again. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and to subscribe to the channel. This will really help the channel to grow and you can be notified of the new videos. And I have something more for you. I chose another video for you to watch. Just click the card here to go to the video. Hope you like it. See you there.